Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's my privilege to welcome Rose from Stanford to join us here today. So Rose is a PhD student at Stanford, advised by D.E. Young from Stanford NLP and Dora Dembski from the Graduate School of Education. And she's been doing, in my opinion, some of the most impactful work in AI for education today. So her work has been deployed, as she'll tell us about, widely across the world, in the US, UK, and India, more than 200,000 students, tens of thousands of teachers and tutors right now. So super excited to hear from her. This work has also been featured in the US Economic Report of the President this year, and recognized by Best Paper Awards at CogSci, at the Cooperative AI Workshop at NeurIPS, and in the Building Educational Applications Workshop. Cool. So thanks for joining us. Please take it away.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Peng-Wei, for the introduction. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming here today. I'm super excited to tell you a little bit about my work on scaling expertise via language models. And specifically, we're going to look at applications to education. So in many fundamental areas of society, like education and healthcare, experts are indispensable. In education, for instance, experts are the experienced teachers that know productive approaches to help a student learn to tackle a hard math problem, or even just simply learn how to read. However, becoming an expert takes a lot of time. Novices, when they enter into the profession, they need to gain this expertise, either through years of practice or from other experts through training and coaching. Unfortunately, access to this expertise is often really limited. Experts are scarce and incredibly expensive to hire. And so as a result, many students, particularly those from underserved communities, are the least likely ones to get a good education, even though they have the most to gain from it. So the lack of access to expertise not only directly affects the quality of their education, but also lies at the heart of broader societal inequities. To tackle this real-world challenge, our computer science community has positioned language models as a really promising solution to democratizing access to expertise. For example, two of the largest ed tech companies have described language models as a transformative force in enabling access to millions in education. However, realizing the potential is far from trivial. Language models cannot yet replicate key aspects of human expertise, like the ability to teach effectively or simply to motivate a student when learning gets difficult. And so when tasked with teaching, language models often miss the mark by offering answers a little bit too quickly, which can undermine student learning and lead to worse academic achievement. Furthermore, language models just lack that inherent human touch needed to keep a student motivated or just accountable for their learning, which can lead to student disengagement with their entire learning process overall. And so what can we do? Instead of these two extremes of either relying on scarce human experts or fully automated AI systems, what if we could actually blend the best of both worlds? Imagine a future where we can empower every person, whether a novice in education or in healthcare, with authentic real-time expertise. What this would mean is that every interaction would feel as though it's guided by an expert, with the scalability of AI enhancing the human touch of the novice. So concretely, in real-time interactions, like teaching a student, instead of the human novice by themselves struggling to help the student, or the model simply giving away the answer, we can enable human novices to perform at an expert level and simultaneously provide students on the other side the quality of interactions typically only a seasoned teacher could have offered. And today what I'm going to do is that I'm going to argue that by embedding expert-like thinking into language models, we can do just that. We can empower every person to become an expert in live interactions, and by doing that, scaling expertise via language models. So to make that vision a reality, my work operates at the intersection of both AI and education. I bring the challenges of real-world education interactions into the heart of computer science in order to make advances in both fields. And I've done so to tackle three key questions. First is in methods. Language models are primarily trained on online internet data, and so they struggle in offline real-world interactions. So how can we adapt models with real-world expert knowledge on how to have these effective interactions? Second is in benchmarks. Evaluating models and interactions is incredibly hard because there is no such thing as a singular correct or incorrect response. And the quality of the response depends so much on the context at hand. And so how can we design reliable evaluations that are aligned to real-world contexts? And lastly is in interventions. Rigorous studies, like randomized controlled trials, are crucial for understanding the concrete impact of AI on education and society at large. But they are rare because they are logistically complex and they depend on building meaningful partnerships with school districts, tutoring providers, teachers, and more. And so how do we actually deploy and rigorously evaluate AI systems at scale in these real-world interactions? So while my research does focus on applications of AI to education, it lays the foundation for how we should think about applying AI to other high-stakes domains like healthcare and law, where novices too are engaging in live and complex interactions, and where there's a universal potential to scale expertise and improve outcomes. Across these three research directions, my research is characterized by dual impact across both AI and education. My work thus far has reshaped opportunity structures in education, particularly benefiting thousands of students and their teachers in underserved communities that I've developed throughout my PhD. In my work, I've also made significant interdisciplinary contributions and led to broad impact at a national level, shaping how AI companies and national organizations think about real-world evaluations of AI systems. And finally, my research has also received broad public endorsements from leaders at the intersection and news coverage from both tech and education outlets, highlighting how my research bridges both computer science and real-world education in impactful ways. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about how we can scale expertise via language models, focus on my work in tutoring. First, I'm going to focus on what we can do in terms of the models that we're building. And to do that, I'm going to present Bridge, which is an adaptation approach that explicitly extracts the latent reasoning patterns of human experts to be able to adapt language models. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend this method and apply this kind of latent expertise to a large-scale randomized control trial that allows us to robustly evaluate the concrete impact of our language model system on real interactions. And to do that, I'm going to talk about Tutor Copilot, which is a real-time human-AI interaction system that empowers human novices to become experts in live interactions. And finally, in the last part of my talk, I'm going to zoom out and give you a broader perspective on how my work will continue to advance the science of both AI and education. The exciting part about this work is how we can combine both computational methods, benchmarks, and rigorous interventions to create scalable, meaningful impact. And so with that, I'm going to begin with Bridge. To unpack what's going on here, I'm going to start off with how we would typically train and adapt a language model. So when we want to adapt a language model, we would start off with curating a small but representative data set of expert written responses. So in our context, that would mean, given a conversational context, like a tutoring conversation, what might an expert say in this setting? And we can use this data set to try to get the model to behave like an expert. So for example, I could use my data set to do in-context learning, or I could try to fine-tune the model directly. And for a really, really long time, these kinds of approaches worked quite well for traditional NLP tasks, like doing text classification, where there's mostly no higher-level cognitive reasoning going on. Unfortunately, though, in these kinds of complex interactions, we get responses that look similar to experts, but they fail in really subtle ways. So in this instance here, I'm showing you a model that was fine-tuned on expert responses. And in this context, the human tutor is proposing this math word problem that the student gets incorrectly. And our fine-tuned model starts off like an expert, like, hey, great try, let's try another problem, but poses the exact same problem the student was already struggling on. And so the key insight here is that human experts actually have to make a lot more inferences about the interactions that aren't directly observable. For instance, what might the student not be understanding in this context? Or how could I tweak the problem to try to guide the student to better understand the concept? So in today's setting, we currently have language models that learn behaviors implicitly through data and training. But what if we could actually make expert thinking explicit into the model? Then we could better understand how human experts reason in these complex interactions and how they write effective responses. To do that, I'm going to introduce an approach called Bridge, which extracts reasoning patterns from experts to make their latent reasoning explicit. What type of reasoning are we interested in capturing here? In these complex interactions with students, we're really interested in how experts make inferences and plan for interaction. So that would include, for instance, assessing the student's understanding given the evidence in the conversation. It could be planning for the goals of the interaction, like the lesson objective here, and figuring out the kinds of strategies they would want to employ to guide the student's thinking. Unfortunately, we can't directly observe what an expert is actually thinking about in the moment. And so in this work, we instead prompt experts to articulate their thought processes out loud. Our work builds on this expansive literature known as cognitive task analysis, which is a widely used technique for manually extracting expertise in real-world domains like education and law. However, unlike traditional uses of CTA, here we're leveraging it to extract latent reasoning at scale to systematically annotate data. And so in our setting, experts are given examples that they have to annotate with their responses, and they'll need to talk out loud about how they're thinking about writing these responses. In our specific setting, we are interested in how experts are thinking about helping struggling students. So our conversations will contain instances where students are either making a mistake on a math problem or maybe struggling with it. And we show these conversations to human experts that have many years of experience across a variety of school settings. This ensures that these teachers or these experts have learned productive approaches to helping many different kinds of struggling students. So returning back to our talk out loud setting, initially these talk out loud transcripts will be pretty long and unstructured. So models out of the box will have a really hard time trying to follow these long reasoning traces. But what we do in Bridge is that as we collect more and more examples, we can start to find similarities in how experts are reasoning. For example, what are they noticing? Or how do they want to respond? And why do they want to respond in a certain way? In our setting, because we're looking at how experts want to help struggling students, common structures that will emerge would be assessing the student's level of understanding. So I think the student was guessing here or just made a careless mistake. To determine maybe a remediation strategy, like I want to provide a hint or an example in this setting. To then also determine a pedagogical intention, so like in order to motivate the student or support their thinking. And with this kind of inferred taxonomy, we can distill them into a discrete set of latent variables to capture how experts think while also instructing language models in a straightforward way. So the way that we do this now is that in addition to the conversational context and the expert response, experts are also, we're also capturing latent variables that mirror the way that experts are thinking in the moment about their responses. So in this case, the expert thought the student was guessing. And so they wanted to provide a problem-solving strategy here, which was drawing apples, to help support their thinking. And once we've collected these kinds of latent variables, we can simply turn them into a set of instructions. So mapping these into natural language instructions of the students seem to have guessed the answer, and so in your response, provide a problem-solving strategy to help support the student's thinking. And now there's a lot of things I can do with this. I could either directly instruct the model to follow these latent thoughts, I could do in-context learning, or directly fine-tune the model to follow these instructions. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to turn to one set of evaluations that we did in this work, which was our human evaluations. So here in this setting, we recruited several teachers, and each of these teachers were shown a conversational context with a pair of responses. And what we did is that we asked these teachers then on a Likert rating, which of these responses do they prefer more, find more useful, or more caring. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to focus on a subset of baselines that we compared against. So we compared the original tutor's response that was actually conducting this tutoring session against our Bridge model. So this was GPT-4 instructed with those expert latent thoughts I'd shown before. Our fine-tuned model, so just fine-tuned on the observable responses. Our zero-shot model that was instructed to generate useful and caring responses. And then finally, our human expert responses. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a graph of reporting our results. So what you can see here is on the x-axis, these are all the dimensions that we ask our human teachers to assess the responses against. And on the y-axis, I'm reporting there the Likert ratings. And what did we find? First, what we found was that our bridge model in purple outperformed the current state-of-the-art methods and models in every dimension. Even more exciting, Bridge closes the significant gap between the state-of-the-art models and human experts, bringing us much closer to expert-level performance. Concretely, Bridge closes at least 60% of that gap between the best-performing baseline model and the human experts. And this improvement was also consistent across all the dimensions that we had assessed for, such as usefulness and others. We can also qualitatively examine the kind of language that's generated because of Bridge. So here what I'll be showing are the most common bigrams, or common pairs of words generated by the zero-shot model versus our Bridge model. And what we find is that in our zero-shot model that was instructed to generate useful and caring responses tends to generate language that's much more about the answer or the outcome of the student's thinking, such as talking about their effort or the correctness of their solution. Whereas our Bridge models tend to generate language that was much more about the student's thinking or developing their understanding. And so these are exciting pieces of qualitative evidence on how we can improve the response quality of language models to scale high-quality learning experiences. What's additionally been exciting about Bridge is how its core ideas extend. So what I've shown so far is how latent structure can be derived from human experts to improve the response quality of language models. But is there a way in which we can automate that process while still maintaining the quality? In prior work, I developed an unsupervised method that automatically extracts latent patterns in text, modeled as stochastic processes. So these latent patterns improve the way that language models can plan and generate long, coherent pieces of text. Separately, these methods have also been applied to other high-impact applications beyond just tutoring. So, for example, we've also applied Bridge to help teachers scaffold their classroom lessons for middle schoolers to ensure that students are also receiving adaptive, high-quality instructional support. And finally, on the real-world impact side, Bridge was also deployed and tested in a large-scale randomized control trial with significant improvements to K-12 student math proficiency. And while I don't have enough time to cover the details of these studies, I'm more than happy to continue that conversation offline. Great. So this now brings us to the second part of my talk, which is on Tutor Copilot. And here what we're going to do is we're going to take those exact same models that were adapted with human expert reasoning to be able to scale high-quality learning experiences across thousands of live interactions. So if we want to improve education at scale, we need to bring more people to perform at an expert level. Studies show that human teachers are still incredibly important for student learning, especially for the engagement and connection with the student. However, as I mentioned in the introduction, training novices to become experts is incredibly costly and slow. Concretely, it totals billions of dollars in national investments just into training for education. And on top of that, even if you were to receive training, with current forms of training, novices still lack that real-time feedback that they need to improve immediately in that interaction. And so as a result, the reality is that novices have to learn through trial and error over the years until they can become experts at having effective interactions. What this also means is years of missed learning opportunities for their students along the way. So this raises a key question. Can we train novices faster by augmenting them with tools that give them real-time expert-level guidance? So in this study, I proposed an approach to augment novice tutors using Tutor Copilot and builds on the intelligence augmentation literature, which talks about how we can use machines to enhance human decision-making. A key aspect of my approach was integrating Tutor Copilot seamlessly into the novice's workflow, so that in the moment of their actual tutoring, they can invoke Tutor Copilot and receive real-time feedback based on pre-validated strategies employed by expert educators, such as asking a question or providing a hint. novices can then think through how they want to take the interaction based on the authentic expertise that I derived from real expert educators. And my theory of change is the following. By elevating the quality of interactions, by giving them real-time expert-aligned feedback, novices can become more effective and students can learn faster as a result. The challenge is actually determining whether this translates to real-world practice. And so to tackle this challenge, I designed and led the first randomized control trial of a human AI approach to live tutoring. RCTs are extremely rare because they are logistically complex, yet they are crucial for rigorously evaluating the impact of AI. Because without this rigorous testing, we risk deploying systems that don't work, or worse, set students back. So in this study, what I did was I worked with a large-scale tutoring provider and a large school district involving 900 tutors and 1,800 students from underserved communities who have the most to gain from higher quality education. And this study allows us to definitively answer questions like how expert-guided AI suggestions, like those generated from Tutor Copilot, impact student learning. It's also crucial to think about how this guidance may affect different kinds of tutors, like less to more experienced tutors. And finally, we would also want to know how these changes are happening, like what is changing in tutor behaviors to drive this kind of change. What are tutors now saying and doing because of Tutor Copilot? So to answer these questions, let me first talk about how I designed the study. As I mentioned before, in this study, I involved about 900 tutors and 1,800 students. All of these students have been identified as needing tutoring, which means that based on their math test scores, they were not meeting state math standards. So these students would particularly benefit more from additional tutoring as well as better quality tutoring. All of these students are also coming from a Title I Southern School District spanning across 9 different schools. And the way that they're receiving tutoring is that it's in school and it's at high dosage. This specific study took place last year in the spring quarter across 2 months, and the final analysis spans across a little bit over 4,000 sessions. As I mentioned before, in this study, I'm conducting a randomized control trial, which is the methodology used to determine the causal effect of a specific action on outcomes. So in this case, I'm really interested on what the impact of Tutor Copilot is on educational outcomes. So to do that, what I did is I randomly split our tutor populations, our tutors, into 2 different groups. So one of the control group, where tutors were simply tutoring as normal, so nothing changes in their day-to-day operations. And the other group is our treatment group. So these treatment tutors get access to Tutor Copilot, as I demonstrated before, during their tutoring sessions. Concretely, to give you a visual of what's happening, our control tutors, so nothing changes on their side. So their typical way of tutoring is that they'll have a problem display on the side and a whiteboard display and an ongoing chat with the students here. And the only thing that changes with our treatment tutors is that they get access to Tutor Copilot, where they can invoke Tutor Copilot at any time, and our pre-validated strategies and suggestions will appear. And under the hood, the way that the responses are generated is that it's generated based on our Bridge GPT-4 model that we had seen before as being the best performing model. Yes, yeah.
Were these, I'm a little unclear on the tutors. They're not people in the room with the student?
Yes, so for context, this is happening in a virtual tutoring setting where a human tutor will virtually meet with a student here in this context.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand for the study, like, what is the context that has created this tutoring model?
So you can imagine as like a Zoom call, right? Like you zoom in, the tutor and student zoom in simultaneously. They'll conduct tutoring. I'm happy to talk also more. Yeah, so I'll talk more about like the concrete details maybe in the Q&A. But for now, just it's a virtual tutoring setting. Tutors and students will meet over this platform. And this is just a tutor-facing intervention. Cool. So now that we have a visual understanding of what control and treatment tutors see, let's get back to answering the questions we were interested in before. So by providing these tutors real-time expert-aligned suggestions, to what extent does Tutor Copilot actually impact student learning? So to answer this question, in the background, what we're doing is that we have a regression model, which we're using to estimate the treatment effect and the statistical significance of the treatment. So in this case, the treatment is, given access or no access to Tutor Copilot, what's the effect on the student's outcomes? What we're also doing in this regression model is that we're including other variables to reduce the amount of error in our estimation. And so with this in the background, I'm going to now report the results. So here what you can see is I'll be showing you a bar graph where on the x-axis I've split up our tutor groups into those that didn't have access to Tutor Copilot and those that did. And on the y-axis, I'm going to be reporting the students' lesson test passing rates. So you can interpret this as a 0 to 1 scale or 0 to 100 scale of them passing their lesson tests. In our study, what we showed is that there is a 4 percentage point statistical significance increase. And in educational interventions, 4 percentage points is a huge increase. Because if we put this into perspective, this would translate to thousands of more lesson tests being passed, meaning that students would be more readily prepared by the end of the year. And increases to their lesson test passing rate is also a significant predictor of improved end-of-year math achievement. So now that we've been able to see the aggregate positive effect of Tutor Copilot, we can now start to investigate some differences in the effects of that treatment. So in the second question, what we're going to look at is how that effect might differ across different groups of tutors. And to do this, we're conducting here a heterogeneity analysis on the tutors' pre-study quality ratings. So what this means is that we're taking the tutoring provider's pre-study quality scores for these different tutors, and we're bucketing them into 3 different groups, what I would call as the low, mid, and high-rated tutors. And the y-axis, again, is that lesson test passing rate outcome I shown before. And so what do we find here? Excitingly, what we found is that the lower quality tutors were particularly benefiting from Tutor Copilot. Concretely, their students were experiencing a 9 percentage point increase on their lesson test passing rates. Why this is so exciting is that there's actually 2 reasons. So from the perspective of the tutoring quality, we're able to raise the floor of educational quality, enabling the less experienced tutors to meet a similar amount of achievement as their more experienced peers. But we can also flip this finding around to the student's perspective. With Tutor Copilots, students are scarcely disadvantaged when they are working with a lower quality tutor. So now that we've been able to quantify the effects of Tutor Copilot, we can start to understand what exactly is changing in the interactions to drive that change. So this leads us to our last question, which is how is Tutor Copilot changing tutoring quality as measured by the language that tutors are using? To do this, we're going to examine the quality of strategies used by these 2 conditions. So in this context, I'm going to define high-quality strategies as those that are deepening the student's understanding, whereas low-quality strategies are those that don't. So they might just directly give away the answer for the student. And drawing on both educational theory as well as empirical observations blinded to the condition, we can establish a taxonomy of what these strategies look like high-quality strategies such as prompting the student to explain or asking a guiding question to the student, to low-quality strategies such as giving away the answer or giving away the solution strategy. And using this framework, I trained classifiers to annotate the language at scale, which allows us to quantify their use across our 2 conditions. So now when comparing these 2 conditions, we find some striking differences in how tutors are communicating to their students. So for example, we find that tutors with Tutor Copilot are much more likely to prompt their student to explain what their answer was or their reasoning process was, whereas tutors without Tutor Copilot are much more likely to just generically encourage their students during the process. I can do the same thing for all the other strategies, and in general what we're finding is that tutors with Tutor Copilot are much more likely to use strategies that are fostering the student's understanding than just delivering information like giving away the answer. So to connect this to our previous results, where we found students were learning faster indeed, these findings indicate that it's because tutors are engaging with their students into deeper thinking and understanding that content. So not just because students are just getting answers. So in conclusion, my large-scale intervention with Tutor Copilot has extremely exciting findings on how we can shape real-world effective practices. From the student's angle, being much more deeply engaged with the content they should be learning, the tutor's angle from leveraging this kind of scaled expertise, and from the scientific angle of how NLP can be used to drive science in education for us to understand what is happening in the interaction. Additionally, what's exciting is I was able to achieve these substantive benefits at a remarkably affordable cost at only $20 per tutor annually based on the study's usage. So Tutor Copilot presents an extremely scalable, cost-effective alternative to traditional approaches of training novices. So this concludes our main story for today. In these two parts of the talk, what I've done is I've centered the challenges of real-world education interactions here. And this led us to discussing how we can adapt models with expert reasoning, design evaluations, and conduct large-scale interventions. Most recently, my works, including Bridge and Tutor Copilot, are also cited in the 2025 Economic Report of the President, shaping discussions at a national level. And through these two works, the report recognizes the potential of AI to truly augment human teaching and learning and reducing educational inequities at scale. Also recently, earlier this month, I returned back to our school district partner who we collaborated with on Tutor Copilot to share our findings and to meet teachers and students to ensure that solutions that we're building in the AI research space are actually improving their learning. So this now turns to the last part of my talk, which is on future work. In future work, I aim to continue to expand the boundaries of how we scale expertise through AI by tackling the challenges of real-world education interactions. And so to achieve this, there are three key future directions of mine guiding that journey. One key future direction is to advance the science of evaluations. So how we evaluate these models and interactions is vitally important. And the current paradigm focuses a lot on short horizon metrics, such as next response evaluations. And I've developed these kinds of metrics also informed by educational theory. So for example, one of my recent studies revealed that actually teachers give disproportionate attention to male students over female students, even when you control for their initial achievement levels. However, we also care a lot about the distal, long horizon measures that are sparse, much harder to iterate on because they span over multiple turns of a conversation and multiple conversations themselves. So the fundamental challenge is how do we create the reliable short horizon proximal measures that are also aligned with the more distal long horizon evaluations. In ongoing work with AI2 and Stanford, I'm co-leading a grant that tackles these questions. And what we're doing here is we're developing a large AI in education benchmark grounded in these longitudinal evaluations. This benchmark will drive improvements not only in AI systems, but also in the quality of real-world interactions. The second key direction is advancing the science of interaction research and broadening how we model real-world interactions. So far, much of the focus in NLP and AI research, including my own talk, has been focused on language as text interactions. And in my work, I've contributed to developing these kinds of systems, like with Tutor Copilot or with EduConvoKit, that automates the analysis of text and education conversations. But there's a lot of things that we miss out on in text. In the real world, especially in K-12 education, so much of our thinking and communication extend out to the visual space, like whiteboard drawings, or audio space, revealing a student's tone of voice, like how frustrated they are, or how excited they are about math. And if we only focus on text, we miss out on all the ways that real kids behave when they're engaged with the interaction. And so this direction raises really exciting challenges and questions about how should we train and evaluate models and authentic multimodal interactions to fully capture how people think, communicate, and interact. And finally, a more applied direction of my research agenda is creating a science of work and labor, focused on how human-AI collaboration completely changes the paradigm of how we think about training skills. So the exciting part of recent studies, including Tutor Copilot, is how it shifts the paradigm of how people are learning by doing in the moment of interaction with real-time guidance. The shift with human AI systems presents a really compelling alternative to traditional ways to do training. And so this raises critical questions for the future, such as how can we maximize people to learn these new skills? Or what happens when AI support is removed or simply not available because your internet connection breaks? Or what other skills are there to train that were traditionally really challenging to do before? So one hypothesis that I'm currently exploring, at least on the topic of skill retention, is this hypothesis that it really depends on how we interact with AI systems. So whether people retain the skills that they've learned, such as in Tutor Copilot, it probably depends on whether users are passively following suggestions generated by Tutor Copilot or other systems, or whether they're critically engaging and customizing these kinds of outputs. And so this line of work is incredibly exciting because it can help us uncover how human-AI collaboration can expand the boundaries of what novices can achieve in traditionally challenging domains. So to conclude, my research is driven by core belief that real-world human expertise, when thoughtfully integrated with AI research, can transform how we scale expertise and improve outcomes universally. Because I believe by embedding expert-like thinking into models, we can empower every person to become an expert in live interactions. So thank you so much for listening. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Rose. We have a bunch of time for questions, so who would like to start?
Thank you, super interesting work. I have a question. Did you also try to apply those techniques to teach something other than math, like writing or something? Because it seems like it's similar techniques, but also somewhat different.
Yeah, just to make sure that I understood the question, like have we also tried it in other skills or domains or like subjects? Yeah, this is a super open space that we've been currently exploring. So right now with the same school district, we're very interested in expanding Tutor Copilot also for ELA or English Language Arts. I think that there's a lot of other interesting aspects when it comes to other forms of skills. So what I'd focused on today in the talk was also about remediation in math, but there's other variations of this of like relationship building skills, so softer skills that we could also train Tutor Copilot for. But yeah, definitely very interested in expanding these boundaries in subjects or also skills, just very dependent on the partner and what they most care about too.
Really great work, thank you. I was curious about if you could say a little bit more about the technical like NLP side of it. Like, so for example, for the bridge system, as I understand it, you took GPT-4 and sort of prompted it to sort of chain of thought prompting style to sort of, do a series of things. Sort of, was it like really the out of the box GPT-4 model, or did you have to fine tune it or modify it in any way?
Yeah, great question. So at the time of the study, the fine-tuning API for GPT-4 or other OpenAI models wasn't released. So the only thing that I had tried here was basically directly instructing or doing like a K-shot setting for just, like, seeing how good these models were. And then the only fine-tuning experience that I'd shown you were more of the open source models. So in comparison, so here, to answer your question, here we were just directly instructing the models. We found the instruction following capabilities of the models just to be really good out of the box. I think that there's a lot more like qualitatively that these models can improve on. So to your point, for instance, when we think about like data collection or like how do we instruction tune the models, there's recent work from Google that's shown that if you separate out the instruction tuning phases of like just doing first traditional instruction tuning on like generic instruction following tasks, and then in the second stage doing more like education instruction tuning, this actually ends up generating a worse model than just if you were to do data mixing like straight from the get-go in your first instruction tuning stage. So I think there's a lot of really interesting explorations for thinking about like how data and methods might blend together for surfacing what I'd shown you to be a much more like human-intensive practice. Yeah, and then the other thing I had shown you before too was in terms of methods, like I'm very interested in like automatic way or synthetic ways in which we can improve models, because I think that there's something inherently very interesting, right? Like what do we kind of state as unobservable information? What's really important in that? And what do models like explicitly just need to be like seen and be trained on in order to improve the quality in these very like complex real world domains?
Cool. And then, sorry, one more follow-up question if I can. So for the instruction tuning that you did for Bridge, so you mentioned these kind of latent states and stuff like that. Were the instructions recovered automatically, or did you sort of manually identify the instructions from analyzing the corpus?
Yeah, so this was kind of, it was a mix of everything. So both analyzing like the talk out loud transcripts as well as like a co-design with the teachers I'd mentioned. So that taxonomy that I had previewed before was kind of a mix of engaging with the educators who were actually writing those responses, as well as doing a lot of the transcription analysis there. So I think there's a lot of really cool work on like, that's very intensive. So to do it for a new task or a new domain, probably not ideal, but is there a way in which we can automate that process to still maintain the quality that we'd seen? Yeah, I think it's a really cool future direction, yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for the talk. I wanted to come back to some of the stuff I was asking about the study, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So it's unclear to me a bit who these tutors are. I guess without understanding the context, these could be highly skilled people who just happen to be using a interface but have like a decade of experience in education, and then there's variance within that you're showing as the expertise. Or these could be people who are working 3 jobs and trying to make a buck, being paid, absolutely nothing. Who are tutors. And I mean, I'm taking 2 very extreme examples, but I have no idea who this pool of people is. I imagine that would affect the findings.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think what you're getting at too is like, well, just broadly, there's a lot of variance in quality, like with teaching and understanding the backgrounds of these tutors matter a lot, whether it's years of teaching that they've done to maybe qualitatively, like they just seem like great teachers. So in our context, and a lot of the tutoring providers that I work with, these are tutors that are generally adults, so they're college educated, or they might be former teachers, and right now they're just kind of retired and might be wanting to engaging in virtual tutoring. Typically what these tutors will go through is that they'll also do tutor training. So for a specific domain or for a specific tutoring platform, they'll receive tutoring on what would seem to be most effective ways for how they should engage in tutoring. To connect that though to like the quality aspect and like trying to reduce variance, you can imagine reduction in variance comes through explicit training, or even just like the provision of real-time training or real-time guidance. So that's to at least situate my work with Tutor Copilot into that literature, into that space.
Are the tutors volunteers? Are they working for a for-profit company?
For Tutor Copilot specifically, they are full-time tutors. So that's what the analysis was conducted on. There are also part-time tutors, but they're not included in this study. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah.
Awesome. Great talk. So following up on one of your last future research aims, how do you think about the role of AI in collaborative learning scenarios, like helping with a Socratic seminar or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's been on my mind quite a bit. So one other study that isn't released yet, but touches on collaborative discourse is that I have data in classroom lessons where you know what teachers say to set up a math task, and then you also have a bunch of different group collaborations going on between students. And there's a lot of variance in how middle school students will engage with math. Some middle school students will not engage at all, and so you're just gonna hear about what they're doing at school, and others will. And I think that there's a really interesting question on, how may AI systems that can operate real time, fast, and understand context in a really messy, noisy classroom environment be able to facilitate these real time discourse? So how can they turn a collaborative group setting that was not super productive to be something a little bit more productive? How could it resolve fights between students that will happen inevitably? So I think this is a really interesting space, because it does navigate this it's under this really exciting area of how can we use AI systems to simply improve the way that we communicate with each other. So still ongoing work, but I think it's a very exciting direction.
And then could I ask one follow-up? Yeah, and then one more follow-up is that There's been some work on like the rational pedagogy literature about like how you can model teaching as like I model, the teacher models what the student may know, is modeling what the teacher may know, and you do this hierarchical inference.
Yeah.
Do you think we need that type of process in the age of language models, or can we just like use like latent chain of thought to kind of abstract that away?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really grounded in a lot of work also like in the space of theory of mind. I think I've done some work in theory of mind, like building explicit models on inferring intentions of agents. I think the trickiness of doing the education research and then seeing how real students behave is that it is very hard to model kids who may not talk a lot or may not give you enough cues or may not give you enough observables that you're currently modeling, let's say in this case in text, right? So I'd mentioned too, like things that we're missing out on are their drawings because I'm not modeling that. But in the Tutor Copilot study, 50% of the activities that were happening in these tutoring sessions was on the whiteboard, right? So I think there may be interesting questions on like, how do we increase the amount of observabilities or like observable items to inform the way that we build mental models of students that can inform like pragmatic ways of teaching or like how we communicate to each other. I think it'll just be very difficult though, because in practice, it's very hard, it's still very, kind of an open field of research of how do you merge what is done across different modalities. So it would be very exciting to explore, but so far I found it a little bit challenging to impose like theoretical pragmatic models like developed in the theory of mind literature to this space to inform like what gets said to a student. Yeah.
Cool. I have a couple of questions if I could ask. So first, in both parts of your talk, it was the same underlying model you used, right? Like Bridge plus GPT-4. In part one, the model did well, but worse than experts. And then in part two, it really improved what these experts, especially the less expert experts, what they could do, right? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on why there was this difference. In the first part, it was clearly worse than the human experts. In the second part, it made them sort of, surpass their typical expert performance. And then more generally, how you think about AI-only systems versus human plus AI systems in education and beyond.
Yeah, so the first question is about like why is there like this huge improvement on the lower end tail? So for that, I think my general hypothesis is like, well, there's a few answers to that. So one is the last, I guess, question that I was showing with like what are tutors now saying or doing in aggregate. So I think one answer could be that strategies or things that novice tutors alone were doing before, like just giving away the answer because it was the easiest thing for them to do, they're not doing that anymore. So that could be happening at the lower end tail. One thing I didn't show, but I think is also equally interesting that I'll show as well is that, so what this analysis does here is that it is only showing you if I give access to a tool, does it improve outcomes? But this result does not disentangle did you use the tool from did you have access. And so in an additional analysis, let me see if I can find my cursor. Okay, so an additional analysis was the following. So given the challenge I just mentioned, like there's differential use potentially. What I'm going to be showing you here is now we're going to extend our analysis here to using a two-stage least squares regression, which means I'm going to first regress, like given that you had access, what was your likelihood of use, and what was the effect of your use on outcomes? And so when I ran this results, what we saw was actually a huge increase in the effectiveness of people who had access and used it. So concretely, this was a 4 percentage point increase. So tying it back to why maybe we saw differential effects across different groups of tutors, one thing that the analysis kind of hides away is like who used it more than others and maybe who benefited it more than others or who retained those skills more than others. This is kind of an open, this is a very open space that I'd be really excited in exploring in future directions with thinking about work and labor when it comes to these kinds of interactions. Yeah.
So in the first part, I guess the AI-only model, you could assume it's basically as if you had a human who always used the Tutor Copilot suggestion, right? And that didn't work as well. So
Sorry, say it again.
So in the first part of the talk, the Bridge plus GPT-4 model didn't work as well as the tutor, right?
Yeah,
And
our expert,
as the expert,
teachers. Yeah.
So if you had a tutor who always just accepted the tutor Copilot suggestion, that would basically be the Bridge plus GPT-4
Yeah,
model.
you would probably maybe be bounded if you have no modifications, although with caveats, because in the previous Bridge evaluations, that was just based on next response, so just a single turn eval. However, in this case, we're evaluating on after many turns, right? What was your interaction like, or across many interactions.
Got it. And do you see that there was any sort of maybe selective usage of tutor pilot, that Copilot, that the humans actually added something to the system?
Yeah, it's a great question because the answer is yes. So there's two ways I can answer this. So in this study, I'd also conducted interviews with these tutors, and so there was selective usage there. So tutors were saying yeah, I found ways in which Tutor Copilot was much more effective for certain lessons than others. They really liked using it for lessons on mean and median because it's really hard to just come up with a good response or explanation to a young student on that. And so what you can infer is also the counterfactual is that they didn't find it as effective for other lessons. And then, let me see, okay. Then there's also maybe differential use based on the kind of tutor that we had. Right now, what we're assuming is that the tutor invokes feedback, so they want to see feedback. And most people might not want to see feedback. And so you might also want to think about what are people's tendency or openness to be able to change what they're doing in practice. Which, getting to maybe the second question, which was broader thoughts on work and labor and human and AI interactions, is that I find these social factors incredibly interesting because this is essentially what a lot of economists that do real field studies have to engage with, right? It's how do real people behave and understanding why they behave in a certain way and not completely adjusting what they do, but what are small interventions that just make sense for their kind of context to be able to improve quality of the interaction or just quality in general. Yeah.
Cool. Thank
Cool.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, you're talking about how LLMs, when a commons student the shortcoming of an LLM is it always spits back without context of a student's shortcomings. And so I was wondering if you ever considered having Tutor Copilot morph around the individual students and their common shortcomings. So every student is unique in their own shortcomings. Maybe a student is always lacking within the visualization stage. Right now it sounds like it's more general use case for all different students. Have you ever considered morphing around individual students?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess it's the broader question of how have I thought about maybe personalization or adaptiveness for different kinds of people, users, students, teachers. Yeah, I think this is something I really want to empirically study because I think personally for me right now, personalization feels very vague. I don't know what that will look like when it comes to either there's so many mechanisms in which personalization can appear, right? Let me list a few that get at this. So for instance, Tutor Copilot, right now I assume the tutor invokes it, but maybe there's a world in which I actually personalize when it gets invoked for certain tutors or for certain students. Personalization could also mean when a tutor invokes it and sees the strategies, the kinds of strategies that get shown by default are ranked order because of some kind of recommendation algorithm that I've personalized to the tutor or the student. Similarly, personalization could mean the responses itself carry some are using instructions that have some inherent knowledge about the student's grade level or what the student seems to be struggling on, did in the past, or is going to work on towards the future. A lot of that is still very open-ended to me, and I would really want to better understand first what is the most high leverage mechanism where I can concretely change the way, improve the way that students are learning, because all of these mechanisms are in some form or personalization, but you can imagine the effect it has on a learning experience could have really wide variation. Yeah.
Thanks. That's a really interesting talk. And I want to go back to the technical aspect of the Tutor Copilot. So you mentioned there are 3 latent stages when you design that. There is the student level of understanding, remediation strategy, and pedagogical intention. So from measurement perspective, whenever anything is latent, we always try to think how to measure those latent stages reliably. So I wonder, like when you design that, first, are these 3 stages from the theory of like effective tutoring? And if so, like do you have to measure, like based on the tutor interaction with the co-pilot tool, do you, or student interaction with the tutoring tool, that you need to measure student understanding on the fly in order to provide a feedback that can tap into those 3 stages?
Okay, so there was the first part of the question I just want to make sure I'm understanding, which is like, how is this maybe taxonomy developed? And the second question, maybe I'll return to that.
It's how you design the tool to make sure the feedback covers the 3 stages. Because you showed an example that an effective tutor is actually, based on the student's understanding, you give the effective remediation strategy and also with intentional pedagogy.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So maybe just to answer this, like this latter question, because it's top of mind right now, is that I had also conducted some ablation studies on what part of the instruction was the model most sensitive to, so what all these 3 stages. And the most sensitive part for steering the quality of the response was the strategy part. So that's why Tutor Copilot under the hood is front-loading all of the strategies. So there's no other, tutors don't have to guess what, or don't have to infer what the student's understanding is or that last part of the intention. So that was a pretty critical design when coming with going from the original bridge model to then disentangling sensitivity of instruction following and model responses to then actually doing real world deployments, because tutors probably don't want to click on a lot of things. So how do we reduce their cognitive burden in the moment? So just distilling it down to that single stage. As for the actual taxonomy itself, I think generally I take a pretty top-down, bottom-up approach of both blending educational theory, what's known, but also just empirically what's happening. Because I think oftentimes, I think this is applicable to education as well as AI research in general, is that theory and practice are quite far apart, but I think that there is real value, such as in this kind of work, where they meet in the middle and they tackle a real-world challenge that these tutors are facing, but also they make pedagogical sense.
Okay, I think we are at time now, so let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.